Robert Hayes didn't come to mountains to be a hero. He came to disappear. The morning he opened his snowbound cabin door, he expected silence. Instead, he found 3 German shepherds frozen upright on porch, buried in snow, ropes biting deep, eyes waiting for him. If you believe no life is placed in our path by accident, type Amen in the comments. And if stories of faith, courage, and second chances matter to you, please like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs hope tonight. Early winter had settled quietly over the high plains of Wyoming, not with violence, but with a steady, patient cold that seeped into wood, into bone, into memory. The sky stretched pale and endless above a forest of tall pines dusted in white, and at the edge of that forest stood a small, aging cabin that seemed less like a home and more like a place someone had chosen not to be found. And inside that cabin lived Robert Hayes, a 75-year-old former Navy SEAL whose body had slowed with time, but whose posture still carried the unmistakable discipline of a man who had spent a lifetime standing straight against pressure. His shoulders still broad, though slightly rounded with age, his hands large and rough with veins that pressed close beneath weathered skin, his face carved with deep lines that did not come from years alone, but from things he had seen and never spoken about. His hair thin and silver, kept short out of habit rather than care, and his eyes, a faded steel blue, were the kind that did not wander but observed, always measuring, always aware. Though lately there was something else in them too, something quieter, heavier, as if part of him had long ago stopped expecting anything to change. Robert had not come to Wyoming for peace. Not really. He had come for silence, the kind that does not ask questions and does not offer answers, the kind that lets a man exist without having to remember why he is still here when others are not. And that reason had a name he rarely allowed himself to think in full: Thomas Reed, taller than Robert had been, quicker to laugh, the kind of man who made hard places feel temporary, a fellow Navy SEAL, a brother not by blood but by everything that mattered more. Thomas had died on a mission years ago, and Robert had lived, and there had been no ceremony that made sense of that exchange, no explanation that felt complete, only the echo of a promise they had both carried: no one gets left behind. A promise that had broken somewhere between gunfire and smoke, and though Robert had returned, though he had aged and worked and eventually retreated into this quiet cabin, the failure had not left him. It had simply grown quieter, like the cold outside. Always present, always waiting. His days now followed a pattern so consistent it almost erased time. He rose when the light filtered through the frost along the window edges, not early, not late. Simply, when the world made itself visible again, he moved slowly but with intention. Each step deliberate, boots placed firmly even on the wooden floor, as if it might shift beneath him. He brewed coffee the same way every morning, strong, black, no sugar, no variation, and he sat at the small table near the window, staring out across the snow-covered clearing where nothing moved unless the wind decided to remind the trees they were still alive. He did not turn on the radio, did not keep a television, did not seek voices beyond his own thoughts, because voices led to memories, and memories led to questions, and questions led to places he had spent years learning how not to go. The cabin itself bore the marks of his presence but not his comfort. Tools neatly arranged, wood stacked in careful lines near the door, blankets folded precisely but rarely used for warmth. It was functional, not welcoming, like a temporary post that had simply lasted longer than expected. And yet, despite the isolation, there was one small disruption to his routine that he could not entirely ignore, though he had tried. Her name was Margaret Collins, a 68-year-old widow who lived nearly half a mile down the narrow road that cut through the trees, her house slightly larger, better maintained. With a faint trace of life that Robert's cabin lacked, Margaret was not a loud woman, not intrusive, but she carried a quiet persistence that had outlasted Robert's attempts to remain invisible. She had soft gray hair, usually tucked beneath a knitted hat, her frame slender but steady, her hands often occupied with something she had made herself. Bread, soup, preserves, small offerings left without expectation. Her face lined gently rather than sharply, the kind of lines that came from years of caring rather than enduring, and her eyes, a warm hazel, held a calm attentiveness that made people feel seen even when they did not want to be. Robert had never asked her to stop coming, but he had never invited her in either. When she knocked, he opened the door just enough to speak, his voice low, measured, polite but distant. He thanked her, accepted what she brought, and closed the door again before conversation could stretch into something personal. Margaret never pushed, never lingered. She simply nodded, sometimes offering a quiet remark about the weather or the road conditions, and then she left, her footsteps soft against the snow, returning to her own quiet life. Robert told himself it was better this way. Distance kept things simple, connection complicated everything, and at his age, simplicity was not just preferred, it was necessary. But there were moments, small and brief, when he noticed the way the cabin felt slightly less empty after she had been there, and those moments unsettled him more than loneliness ever had, because they suggested something he had long decided was no longer his to have. On that particular morning, the cold felt sharper than usual, not harsher, just more defined. As if the air itself had edges, Robert stood from the table after finishing his coffee. His joints stiff but responsive, he pulled on his coat slowly, each movement economical, practiced, and he paused briefly near the door, his hand resting against the worn wood. Not out of hesitation, but out of habit, the kind formed in places where stepping outside always meant entering something uncertain. He opened the door without ceremony, expecting the same stillness, the same unbroken field of white that had greeted him every morning since he arrived. But instead, something interrupted the pattern. At first, it was only shapes, 3 dark forms against the pale background, upright, unmoving, positioned along the porch posts. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in fear, but in focus, the part of him that had never truly retired sharpening instantly. He stepped forward onto the porch, boots pressing into the packed snow, and the shapes resolved into something far more precise. 3 German shepherds, bound upright to the wooden columns, their bodies held unnaturally straight by thick ropes looped beneath their front legs and tightened across their chests, their fur almost entirely buried beneath layers of snow and frost, ice clinging to their ears, their backs, their legs, as if they had been left there long enough for the storm to claim them piece by piece. They did not move, not immediately, but they were not still in the way of lifeless things. There was tension there, faint, fragile, the smallest indication of breath that barely disturbed the air. Robert did not speak, did not react outwardly, but something inside him shifted, not sudden, not dramatic, just a quiet, undeniable recognition. He had expected silence, but instead, the past had found him again, standing on his porch, waiting. And for the first time in a long while, the stillness he had built his life around felt less like protection and more like a question he could no longer avoid. The cold did not rush that morning. It pressed, slow and deliberate. The cold wrapping itself around everything it touched. It pressed as Robert Hayes stood on the porch of his cabin, wrapping itself around everything it touched beneath his boots. As Robert Hayes stood on the porch of his cabin, his breath visible in thin clouds that vanished almost as quickly as they formed. His breath, visible in thin clouds that vanished almost as quickly as they formed, were the 3 dogs. And in front of him, no longer shapes but against undeniable lives suspended between survival and surrender. No longer shapes, their bodies undeniable lives suspended between survival that had begun to claim them. Their bodies rigid had gathered thick across their backs and heads, had begun to claim them, clinging in heavy layers. The snow had gathered thick across their backs and turning fur into frozen armor. Clinging in heavy layers that dulled their natural color. Even beneath that weight, turning fur into frozen armor, A presence that even refused to disappear quietly. There was something unmistakable. Robert's eyes moved from one to the next with the same careful assessment he had once used in places far more dangerous. To the next with the same careful assessment he had once used in places far more dangerous. Broad and powerful, the largest, the unnatural position to the steps. A German shepherd whose black and tan coat was almost entirely hidden beneath frost. A German shepherd, only the darker lines along his shoulders entirely hidden beneath frost. His ears remained upright. Only the darker lines along his shoulders breaking through his eyes. Dark his ears steady, remained upright, fixed on Robert with a kind of restrained and his eyes, dark that did not beg and did not accuse. On Robert with a kind of restrained dog accustomed to holding position, did not beg and did waiting for command. This was a dog accustomed to holding position. He did not collapse into panic. And even Robert now felt the weight of that discipline. He did not collapse into panic. As if it echoed something he recognized in himself. The weight of that discipline. He would later call him Duke. As if it echoed something he recognized in himself. In his mind. He would later call him Duke. To the right of Duke stood the second dog. The name had not yet formed slightly in his mind. Her body to the right of just enough to reveal the strain in her stance. Slightly leaner. Her coat, her body angled just enough to reveal the strain in her stance. Her frame narrower but strong. Her coat, a lighter tension in the way she held herself. Her frame narrower but strong. But caution. There was a tension in the way she held slightly, eyes tracking Robert with sharp awareness. Measuring her distance, head tilted slightly, intent, eyes tracking Robert with sharp awareness. In this state, she had not surrendered her instincts. Intent, her back leg trembled faintly. Even in this state, she had not surrendered her instincts. Her back leg trembled into muscle. Not from fear, Robert could see where the rope had cut into her fur, working its way deeper into muscle. Leaving a darkened line beneath the frost. Robert could see where the rope would later be Luna, fur, though for now she was simply a presence that refused to trust without reason. She would later be Luna. Between them, now she was simply a presence that refused to trust without reason. Smaller. Between them, his frame slightly less filled out. Was the third. The snow had gathered thickest on him. His frame down his head so that it dipped slightly forward. The snow had gathered thickest on him. His breathing came in shallow, weighing down his head so that it dipped slightly forward. Barely enough to fog the air before disappearing. Uneven bursts. His eyes blinked barely enough to fog the air. Even that small motion required effort. His eyes blinked. There was no strength in the way he stood. Even that small motion required effort. The fragile there was no strength that exists just before something gives way. Persistence. Robert felt something kind that exists just at the sight something gives way. Not pity. Robert felt something tighten, but recognition of a limit approaching. Not this pity one would not last long without intervention, but recognition of a limit later be called Scout. This one would not last long without intervention. The line between action would later be called Scout. The wind shifted slightly. It was simply the line with it a faint metallic scent that did not belong to the forest. Shifted slightly, carrying with it a faint metallic scent that did not belong to the forest. His mind moving through possibilities without needing to speak them imperceptibly. Exposure alone, his mind moving through possibilities without needing to speak suggested more. Exposure alone could explain the condition. Something deliberate. The scent suggested more. He took a single step forward. Ingested. Boots pressing deeper into the snow. And that he was took a single step forward. Duke's boots pressing deeper into the snow at first, and that was tightening through the neck and shoulders that quickly escalated into something more violent. A tightening through the neck and shoulders that quickly escalated into something more violent. Struggling against the unnatural restraint under the weight of the rope, gathering faintly at the edge of his mouth against the unnatural thin white traces. Foam gathering faintly at the edge of his mouth before freezing his body white traces. And for a fraction of a second, the world around Robert narrowed to that single point of movement. And for a fraction of a second, the world around Robert narrowed to that single point of movement. His hand moved to the knife at his body, responded the motion slower than it would have been years ago, but still precise, to the knife at his still controlled. The motion slower than it would have been years ago, but still precise, not yet, because still something held him in place. Yet he did not reach the dog immediately, but memory, not yet, because something held him in place. The echo of another moment when a body had convulsed in his arms. And sharp, when blood had replaced snow, another moment when a body had convulsed in his arms. Thomas Reed's blood had replaced uninvited into his mind. Replaced cold. The same stubborn refusal to let go flashed the same silent to his mind that someone act. The same stubborn refusal to let go. Felt the familiar weight of that silent demand pressed against someone act. Heavy, suffocating. And Robert felt the familiar weight of that question it always against him. Why him? Why still here? Asking the same question it always tightened around the knife handle. Why him? And for a brief moment he hesitated. His grip not because he did not know what to do, and for a brief moment he knew exactly what it would mean to step forward. Because he did not know what to do, choosing again, but because he knew exactly what it would mean to step to involve himself. It would mean choosing again, losing something he had already decided he could not afford to lose again. to risk losing something he had already decided he could not afford to lose again. Margaret Collins stood at the edge of her own window, unseen, her figure partially obscured by the curtain she held back with one own window. Her breath, her figure partially obscured by the curtain she held back with partially obscured by the curtain she had seen Robert step onto the porch. Her breath had seen the shapes before she watched the scene unfold. Every instinct in her urged her to go. She had seen Robert across the snow and offer help. Had seen the shapes before he immediately, and though every instinct in her closed her eyes briefly to run across the snow and offer curtain to rest against her chest. She did not move immediately. Her lips moving in a quiet prayer. Her eyes carried no urgency and her hand lowering from the curtain to rest against her chest. She was a woman who had learned moving in a quiet prayer that carried no urgency and tone, not every moment required rushing. She was a woman who had learned through years of loss, a surrender of control before action. But not every moment required rushing. Asking not for the situation to change, a surrender of control of the man standing on that porch to rise to meet softly. When she opened her eyes, the situation to change, Robert had not yet moved. For the strength of the man, she understood then that whatever happened next would not come from her. When she opened her eyes again, it would come from him. Robert had not yet moved on the porch, and she understood then that whatever happened next would not come from her. Not from recovery, but from exhaustion. From him, his strength fading under the combined weight of Duke's body began to slow. Whatever had entered his system, not from recovery, but from exhaustion, slightly. His strength the tension of the rope as if preparing for something, and whatever had entered his system, never leaving Robert, shifted slightly. Scout's head testing the tension of the rope, breathing, preparing for something. The moment stretched, never leaving Robert and fragile, while Scout's head and Robert exhaled slowly, his breathing shallower, the sound barely audible but enough to mark the decision forming, thin and fragile. He looked at the three dogs Robert again, exhaled slowly, not as a problem, the sound barely audible but enough to mark a decision but as something placed directly in his path. He looked at the three dogs again, something that demanded a response whether he wanted it or not. His shoulders rose placed directly in his path, steadying, something that demanded a response whether he wanted it or not. His shoulders rose and fell once, I'm too old for this, and he muttered even as he said it, his feet shifted forward. One step onto the porch, then another. I'm too old for this. The old discipline overriding the hesitation. His feet shifted forward, falling away just enough onto the porch to take its place. The old discipline overriding the hesitation. The years falling away just enough for action to take before the outcome could be known. And in that quiet, Robert Hayes chose not to walk away. The knife cut the decision, first rope, once made, before the outcome could be known. It moved through Robert Hayes the way old instincts always had. Once made, steady, did not linger in doubt, unquestioned. It moved through Robert Hayes the way old instincts always had. As if time itself had stepped aside just enough to let him be the man he used to be. His body shifting forward, as if time itself had stepped aside just enough to let him be the man he used to be. His hands did not move as fast as they once had. The cold, but there was no hesitation at his joints, only execution. His hands did not move as fast as they onto the porch. Snow, there was no hesitation boots, only the knife already in his grip. He stepped fully onto the porch, precisely as he reached for the first rope securing the knife already in his grip. The fibers were thick, blade angled precisely as he reached for the first rope securing Duke. And as he pressed the blade against it, he felt the resistance before it gave. Not the kind of person used without knowledge, but requiring force. And as he pressed the blade against it, he felt the resistance before it gave. The cut, his legs buckling under requiring force, and Robert caught him. Duke's body sagged the instant the tension released, guiding the weight his legs buckling under boards to keep his head from striking not with speed, but with placement steady, despite guiding the weight down against the wooden boards to keep his head from striking hard. But from his breath meeting urgency, despite the strain, easy. His arms trembling under his breath, not from fear. The word quiet, but from age meeting urgency, as if it carried command rather than comfort. He muttered under his breath. Duke's body continued to twitch, quiet but firm. Weaker now, as if it carried uneven beneath Robert's fingers as he pressed them along Duke's the dog's body continued to twitch. The rhythm irregular now, but present. Pulse uneven beneath Robert's fingers as he pressed them along the dog's side. To focus on anything beyond the irregular but present. He cut the remaining rope with measured movements. Robert did not allow himself to focus on anything before shifting his attention to Luna. He cut the remaining rope with measured movements. Not once. Freeing Duke watched everything with sharp, before shifting his attention to Luna, as if deciding in real time whether Robert belonged in her world or not. Watched everything with sharp, calculating eyes, lowering as if deciding in real time whether Robert belonged in her world or not. In awareness, he approached her slower. You're next, lowering his posture slightly. And though she flinched when the blade touched the rope near her chest, "You're next," she did not snap, he said quietly, did not pull away. And though she flinched when the blade touched the rope near her chest, of discipline she did not somewhere beyond a simple home environment. Her restraint spoke of training, and Robert guided her down carefully somewhere beyond a simple of the injured leg that now bore weight unevenly. And Robert guided her down carefully under her breath, mindful of the injured leg that now bore weight unevenly, refusing to collapse softly under her breath when it touched the wood beneath pain. But she held herself upright. The smallest of the three, refusing to collapse fully. And by the time Robert reached him, beneath the young dog's head, the smallest of the three, Scout, was breathing shallow enough that it seemed to vanish between each exhale. The young dog's head had dropped, felt a tightening in his chest, breathing shallow enough that it seemed to vanish between each exhale. Not memory, but urgency. Robert pressing harder. A tightening in his chest. He cut the rope quickly. Not memory, than he had the urgency pressing harder. And when Scout's body fell forward quickly, it was lighter than expected. He had the others. Too light, and when Scout's body fell visible beneath frozen, it was lighter than expected. Robert gathered him against his chest, instinctively visible beneath the cold from the dog's body seeping through his coat. Robert gathered him against his chest instinctively. The cold from the dog's body seeping through his coat as if trying to claim him out before he could stop them. Stay with me. The same words he had once spoken in a different place, slipping out before he could stop them. And for a moment, the past and present blurred together, but he forced himself back. A different war, grounding in the weight of the past and present blurred together, but he forced himself back. This time, grounding in the weight of the animal in his arms. He carried Duke first in reality that this time, pushing the cabin door open with his shoulder. He carried the interior no warmer than outside, but pushing the cabin door open with his shoulder, which was enough for now. The interior no warmer than outside, but shielded from the wind. Then returned immediately for Luna. He laid Duke near the hearth on the braided rug. Her eyes never returned immediately for Luna, always tracking, who allowed him to lift her. Though her eyes never left the door, and when Robert set him down beside the others, he paused for only a second. And when Robert set him down beside the others, 3 lives now inside his space. Long longer distant problems, but immediate 3 lives now inside his space. He moved without thinking. No longer distant problems, but immediate responsibility near the wall. He moved, stacking it in the hearth with practiced efficiency from the small pile near the wall, but capable. Stacking it in the hearth with practiced efficiency. His fingers stiff, because he had forgotten how, but because his hands no longer obeyed as quickly as they once had. Not because he had forgotten how, but because his hands no longer obeyed as quickly as they once had. Then stronger. When the fire's light casting a soft glow across the room that had not felt alive in a long time. The fire's light casting a soft glow across the room that had not felt alive in a long time. Focusing warmth at the core. Robert removed his outer extremities and laid it across his mind, recalling protocols he had not consciously accessed in years. Not the extremities. He moved to the kitchen, his mind recalling protocols he had not consciously accessed in years. The pipes groaning as if moved to the kitchen, the sudden filling an old metal pot with water warmed. The pipes returned with groaning as if protesting it gently against Duke's chest. When the water warmed, he returned with Scouts rotating between pressing them, it gently against Duke's chest. Not words meant to soothe, but Scouts rotating between them, here, speaking occasionally. Once, not words meant to soothe, but to another time. You're here. Watched him the entire time. Stay her amber eyes sharp. Another despite exhaustion. Luna watched him the entire time. Responded. Her amber eyes the faintest shift when Robert adjusted the blanket beneath him. Scout barely responded. Passed without measure. Only the faintest shift when Robert adjusted the blanket beneath the fire and the gradual return of steadier breathing from Duke. Marked only by the growing strength of the fire and the gradual return of steadier breathing from Duke. Not because he had forgotten others existed. When the knock came at the door, but because he had not expected them to enter. Not because he had forgotten others existed. He stood slowly and opened the door wider than he opened the door wider than he ever had. Margaret Collins stood there. Margaret Collins stood there. Thick wool coat, bundled in a thick wool coat from the cold. Her cheeks flushed. A small container of soup held a small container of soup held carefully. Her expression not alarmed. Her expression not alarmed, but deeply attentive. But deeply as if she had already prepared herself. As if she had already prepared herself for what she might see inside. I thought you might need this. I thought you might need this. She said, her voice carrying warmth that contrasted sharply with the air around them. Sharply with the air around them. Robert stepped aside without speaking. Robert stepped aside without allowing her to enter. Allowing her to enter. Small but significant. Small but significant. Inside, Margaret took in the scene quickly. Margaret took in the scene quickly. From one dog her eyes moving from one dog to the Robert. She did not ask unnecessary questions. She did not ask unnecessary questions. Did not overwhelm the space with concern. Did not overwhelm the space with concern. She set the container on the table and moved closer to the table and moved closer to the hearth. Carefully beside Scout. Carefully beside Scout. Her movements gentle but assured. Her movements gentle but assured. He's the weakest. She said quietly. He's the weakest. More observation than question. More observation than question. Robert nodded once. Robert nodded once. Without heat. He won't last without heat. Reached out slowly. Margaret reached out slowly. Catch her scent. Letting Scout catch her scent before her fingers light against his fur. Her fingers light against his fur. He's still here, she murmured. He's still here, almost to herself. Then she looked up at Robert. Then she looked up at Robert. Steady. Her eyes steady. Are you? So the words lingered longer than he expected. Lingered longer than he expected. Not accusatory. Simply true. Comforting. They worked together in quiet rhythm. Margaret handing him cloths. Margaret adjusting him blankets. Adjusting her presence, filling the space without crowding it. For the first time since he had arrived in Wyoming, Robert did not feel the need to retreat from another person. Finally lifted his head slightly, his eyes clear now. His eyes Robert exhaled slowly. Robert exhaled he had not allowed until that moment. Margaret stood and moved back toward the table, opening the container of soup, warm and grounding. The scent warm and grounding. She handed him a spoon. She handed him a spoon, she said. You should eat. And though he almost refused out of habit, the action simple but unfamiliar. They sat in brief silence. Broken only by the crackle of the fire and the steadying breaths of the dogs. And when Robert later placed small pieces of softened food near Duke, then Scout, then Luna, he noticed something that made him pause. Moved toward the bowls. Not even Duke. Instead, not even Duke. When he picked up the food and held it in his hand, Duke leaned forward and took it carefully. Followed after a moment. Luna followed after her hesitation fading just enough, though weaker, and Scout responded only when Robert's hand remained close. Margaret watched this quietly. Her expression thoughtful rather than surprised. And after a moment, the fire had settled into a steady rhythm. By the time the light outside shifted from pale gray to a muted afternoon glow. Robert did not answer immediately, but his hand fully warmed the land, but steady, revealed just enough to expose what the night had tried to conceal. And in that simple act, something in him shifted. Hayes stood near the window for a long moment, not erased, his mug untouched in his hand. Just enough to suggest that the silence he had chosen might no longer be the only disturbances that now stood out. The fire had settled into a steady rhythm by the time the light outside the snow across the clearing was no longer a muted afternoon glow. There were patterns, the kind that never fully warmed the land, but did not belong just enough to expose what the night had tried to conceal. And once he noticed them, Robert Hayes stood near the window for a long moment. That had spent decades reading terrain untouched in his hand, returned quietly. His eyes not on the forest itself, but with absolute disturbances that now stood out. Where before there had been only white. His body slower now, but the snow across the clearing was no longer untouched. You shouldn't be out long. There were patterns there behind him. Interruptions, her voice that did not belong to wind as she stood near the branches. Adjusting the blanket around them, Scout, could not unsee who had begun to show the faintest signs of spent decades reading terrain. His breathing no longer shallow, quietly, though still fragile. Almost reluctantly, Robert paused with absolute clarity. He set the mug down and moved toward the door. He replied. His body slower and now, then he stepped outside. No less deliberate. The cold striking him immediately. Sharper now against skin that had warmed slightly indoors, but attentive. The porch boards creaked again under his weight. Adjusting the blanket around Scout, he looked again to show the faintest where the dogs had been bound. His breathing no longer shallow, faintly where the ropes had pressed into it. Robert paused only briefly, reaching down to pick up one of the severed lengths he had cut earlier. The rope was stepped outside, the tightly woven synthetic fiber, resistant to moisture, against skin that had warmed slightly in ordinary sheds or used for simple tasks. Again under his weight. He ran his fingers for a moment. He looked at the empty spaces where the dogs had been once held. The wood, and still he turned his attention where the ropes had pressed into it. Though cut, then he crouched. Structure was reaching down to pick up one of the severed lengths he had cut earlier with a secondary locking hitch. Efficient, tightly woven synthetic fiber, designed resistant not just to hold weight, but not to control it. Found in ordinary sheds not improvised for simple tasks. This was method. He ran his fingers along it, feeling the texture. The tension it had once held. Jaw tightened slightly. Then he turned his attention to the knot in recognition. Though cut, he had seen knots like this structure was still visible, not in domestic settings, loop, but in a secondary locking hitch, in controlled handling environments where animals were restrained not just to hold weight, but for to control it. He stood slowly, was not improvised, stepped off the porch. This was method, moving toward the edge of the clearing where the snow had been disturbed. The tracks were faint, tightened slightly, partially covered by drifting snow, but in recognition, but still visible enough for someone like this to read them. Not in domestic settings, grooves, but in transport rigs. in controlled handling environments where animals were restrained, not for safety. Instead of following the narrow path that led to the cabin, the vehicle had approached from a break in the tree line to the east, moving toward the edge of the clearing not where the snow unless you knew it was there. The tracks were faint now, partially covered by drifting snow, not to disturb them further, but still visible enough. And then he saw where they ended abruptly. Not because the vehicle had vanished, grooves, but because someone had attempted to conceal them. Not small, pine branches had been dragged across the angle of entry was wrong for the main road. Scattered in a pattern meant to disrupt following the narrow path that led to the cabin, the vehicle had enough to obscure the direction of departure to the east. Robert straightened, not obvious unless you knew it was there. Despite the cold tightening around tracks a few steps, someone had come here to disturb them further. Someone who knew and then how he saw where they ended up drawing attention. Not because the vehicle had vanished, who had taken the time to leave 3 trained dogs in a position that ensured suffering had been dragged across the surface. Not immediate. Scattered in a pattern that realization shifted something deeper than curiosity, but enough to obscure the direction of departure. Something Robert straightened. His breath he turned back toward the cabin, the cold tightening around still him. In his hand. Someone had come here deliberately, someone who knew how to move now, without drawing attention. Not just a barrier against someone the cold, who had taken the time to leave 3 trained dogs in a position that ensured suffering would be prolonged. Not an expression searching his face, that realization shifted something deeper than curiosity. She asked pressed against something older, something unresolved. Held up the rope slightly. He turned back toward the cabin. The rope still in his hand. His voice low, but as he stepped inside, the warmth Margaret felt closer now, studying the fibers. Not just a barrier against the cold, though she did not have his experience, but a space holding she evidence, could see the precision questions, the lack Margaret of praying, looked up as he entered, the intentional design, her expression searching his face. You think rather someone than the brought them here? In his hand. She asked, "What is it?" Robert nodded once, quietly. "Not think." Robert he replied, held up the rope slightly. "I know. This wasn't random." He set the rope down on the table and moved toward his voice low, but certain beside him. Margaret, the young dog's eyes fluttered open slightly as Robert's hand approached. Though she did not have his experience, not pulling away, she could see the precision in it, just the acknowledging presence, the intentional Robert's design. Robert's gaze shifted to the collar around Scout's neck. "Someone brought them here?" She asked. Something he had not fully examined Robert before. Nodded once. "It was worn, not damaged," he replied. "Leather, I know, well fitted, not a stray collar." He set the rope down on the table and moved carefully, Scout, fingers steady as he unclasped the buckle. The young dog's eyes fluttered open briefly, but did not resist. Robert's hand approached. And as Robert turned the collar away, hands, not resisting, something caught his attention. Acknowledging presence. The stitching along one section was uneven, shifted to the collar around the Scout's neck. Not something he had not fully examined before. He pressed his thumb against it, not damaged. Feeling the slight give leather, the thread, well fitted, not a stray's collar. The tip of his knife. He reached forward carefully, the seam, fingers steady as he unclasped the buckle. Lay beneath. Scout the leather parted slightly, did not resist, and a thin strip of laminated material collar in his hands, no larger than caught his attention. Robert, the stitching along one section was uneven, thicker than the rest. Held it up to the light from the window. Decorative, not accidental. Words small, he pressed his thumb against it, feeling the slight give beneath the thread. The phrase then did not belong to the knife to gently lift the seam. It did not belong to the dog, careful not to damage what lay beneath, or rather to the life he had once lived. And a thin strip of laminated material slipped than anyone else, no larger than Thomas Reed. The words did not held it up to the light from the window. They landed. The printed words, small but unmistakable. Undeniable. Leave no one behind. Robert's hand tightened slightly around the strip. To the collar. His breath it did not belong to the dog. Something long buried pushed its way forward. Or rather, this to the life he had once lived. Not a random alignment more times than anyone else. This was placement. Thomas Reed. Intentional. The words did not echo. Margaret watched him closely, heavy, her expression shifting as she recognized the change in him. Robert's hand tightened slightly around the strip softly, his breath not slowing as something long buried pushed its way forward. Immediately, his eyes still fixed on the coincidence. On the words that had once been a promise and had become a burden. This was placement. He used to intentional and precise. He said finally. Margaret watched him closely. His voice quieter now, her expression less shifting as she recognized the change slowly. "You know maybe he still is," she replied. She said softly. Robert looked up as a question. Something unsettled but did not answer immediately. His eyes still fixed on the strip. Not sharply, on the words that had once been a promise and had become a burden. Margaret did not argue. He used to say closer. Her presence steadily. "Maybe." His voice quieter she said gently. Less guarded, but that doesn't mean he's done. The words maybe he still between them, she replied, not forcing belief. Robert looked up at her, but offering perspective. Something unsettled but clearer in his gaze. Robert looked back at the collar. Gone. he said. At the rope on the table. Not sharply, but firmly. At the faint marks on the porch. Margaret did not argue through the window. She simply stepped closer. And then, at the three dogs lying near the fire. Maybe, she said gently, now breathing steadily. But that doesn't mean he's done. Resting, but alert. The words lingered between barely them. Holding on, not forcing all of belief, it aligned, too precisely to ignore, too deliberately to dismiss. Robert looked back at the collar. He exhaled at slowly, the rope on the table, setting the strip down beside the faint marks on the porch. His mind no longer searching for whether this mattered. And then, at the three dogs what it required. Near the fire, Margaret moved back toward now the breathing hearth. Steadily, her hand resting briefly on Luna's but side. Alert. The dog's Scout barely holding on. No all of it rejecting too precisely to ignore. I saw something too deliberately to dismiss. Margaret said after a moment. He exhaled slowly, her voice setting the strip down beside the rope. His mind Robert no longer searching for whether this mattered, a truck, but for what it required. Late at Margaret night, moved back on the main road, deeper in the trees, her hand resting briefly on Luna's side. But I heard the dog's ears flicking in acknowledgement, not wild, no longer rejecting her presence, like they were being kept somewhere. Last week. Margaret's attention sharpened. Her voice thoughtful. He asked. Not urgent. Margaret shook her head slightly. Turned slightly listening. He asked. A truck. Margaret shook her head slightly. Late at night. I couldn't see. Not on the main road. Here, deeper in the trees. But it came from the east side. Much of it beyond the ridge. But I heard dogs. The same direction as the tracks. Not wild. Not strays. Not controlled. Like they were being kept aligning further. Not complete Robert's yet, attention sharp, forming a pattern. Where? Margaret stepped closer again. Margaret, her voice quieter now. I don't think you're supposed to face this alone. But it came from the east side, not as beyond the ridge, but as a statement. The same direction as the tracks. Robert looked at her. Robert really looked slowly. This time. The pieces aligning further, not as an interruption, but as someone choosing to stand in the same space closer again. Despite her voice not quieter now. And for the first time, I don't think you're supposed to face this alone. Away, she said. He simply nodded once. The gesture, small but decisive. Robert looked at her. You're really already here this time, he said. Not as a neighbor. And Margaret's lips not as an interruption. Not into a smile choosing to stand in the same space understanding. Despite Robert not having turned back toward the window, and for the first time, the forest he did not no longer just a backdrop of silence. He simply nodded at once, holding answers he could not ignore. Small but decisive. And as his gaze settled on the faint line where the tracks had been, he said. And Margaret's lips curved slightly. This was not into a smile of relief, not unfortunate, but one of understanding. Not coincidence. Robert turned back toward the window. This was a message. The forest, no longer just a backdrop of silence, deliberately, but a place holding answers he knew exactly what it would mean. And as his gaze settled on the faint line where the tracks was gone, he understood the weight of them had not disappeared. This was not random. It had simply found its way back to him. Timing, and this time, not coincidence. Robert Hayes did not turn away from it. The message did not sit quietly in Robert Hayes' mind. Deliberately. It moved. Pressing against years exactly what it would silence until stillness itself the man who had once said those words was gone. By the time the fire burned low into the evening, disappeared. He had already made a decision that no longer belonged to hesitation. And this time, Robert strip of laminated words lay on the table beside the message did not sit quietly in Robert Hayes' mind. For the first time in years, Robert reached for something against years of practiced silence until stillness itself felt beneath the lower shelf near the wall. And by the time the fire burned low into the evening, dulled with age, he had already made a decision that no longer belonged to hesitation. Not out of uncertainty, but out of laminated words lay on the table beside the coiled rope were remnants of a life he had chosen to leave behind. Robert reached for something he had long kept buried, a worn photograph, an old metal box tucked beneath the lower shelf near the wall that had not been powered on in years. Its surface scratched and dulled, paused over it briefly. He opened it slowly, then closed around it, not out of uncertainty, the motion but out of respect for what it held. Reactivating not just a device but a part of remnants of a life he had chosen to leave behind. Several attempts for the battery to respond. A worn screen flickering before stabilizing, and when it outdated phone that had not been powered on in years. He had not looked at. His fingers paused over it briefly. Names then closed around to another world. The motion deliberate, as if reactivating not just a device but a part of himself. Emily Reed. Took several attempts for the battery only a fraction of a second before the screen flickering before stabilizing. The line rang when it did longer than expected. Robert scrolled through each contacts he had stretching the moment just enough to bring back the weight of what he was about to reopen to another world. When the voice answered, it was steady. He found the one he needed. A woman accustomed to uncertainty, Reed, grounded in control. He hesitated only a fraction of a second before pressing call. Her tone direct, longer than expected. Robert exhaled quietly, stretching the moment just enough to bring back the weight of what he was about to reopen. There was a pause when the voice answered. Confusion. It was
but
steady,
recognition catching
alert.
up with memory.
A woman accustomed to
Reed
uncertainty
was in her early
but
40s
grounded
now,
in control.
though Robert still remembered
"This is
her as a
Emily,"
teenager,
she said,
tall and
her
lean
tone
like
direct,
her father,
professional.
with dark brown hair
Robert
she often
exhaled
kept tied
quietly.
back. Her
"Emily,
features sharper
it's
than
Robert
most,
Hayes."
shaped
There
not
was
just
a
by
pause,
genetics but
not
by years
confusion,
spent building a
but
career in
recognition
catching up
investigation.
with memory. Her eyes,
Emily Reed was in
green,
her early 40s
had
now.
the same intensity
Though
Thomas
Robert
once
still
carried,
remembered her as a teenager,
though hers was
tall
tempered
and lean
with restraint
like her
rather
father.
than impulse. With dark brown
She
hair,
had chosen law
often kept tied
enforcement
back,
not out of rebellion,
her
but
features
out of continuation.
sharper than most, finishing
Shaped
something
not
she
just by
believed her
genetics,
father
but
had not. By years
and
spent
though
building
time
a
had
career in
distanced them,
investigation,
Robert knew she had not forgotten
her eyes,
him.
a deep green,
"Robert?"
had the
she
same
said after a
intensity
moment.
Thomas once carried.
Her voice softer
though
now,
hers
but
was
no less
tempered
steady.
with restraint rather
"I
than
didn't
impulse.
expect to hear from you again."
She had chosen law enforcement
He did
not
not
out of
waste time
rebellion
on
but out of
explanations.
continuation.
"I found
finishing
something,"
she
he said.
believed her father had
3
not.
dogs,
And though
trained,
time had
restrained,
distanced them,
left to die.
Robert knew she had not forgotten
And one of them
him.
had this.
"Robert,"
He paused briefly,
she said after a
glancing
moment,
at the strip on the
her
table.
voice softer now,
"Your
but
father's
no less steady.
words.
The silence
I didn't
that
expect to
followed
hear
was
from you
different,
again.
heavier.
He
Not
did not
disbelief,
waste time on
but
explanations.
focus sharpening.
I found
"Where are
something,"
you?"
he
Emily
said.
asked.
3
Robert
dogs,
gave her the
trained,
location,
restrained,
concise,
left to die,
exact,
and one of them
and
had
she responded
this.
without
He paused
hesitation.
briefly.
"I'll be there
glancing at the
tomorrow
strip
morning."
on the table.
The call
Your father's
ended
words.
without excess. The silence
Without
that followed was
unnecessary
different,
emotion.
heavier, but the
Not
connection
disbelief
itself was
but
enough. Focus sharpening.
The past had been
"Where are
reopened.
you?" Emily
And now
asked.
it was moving
Robert
forward.
gave her the location.
Margaret watched him
concise,
from across the room.
exact, her
And
expression
she responded
calm,
without
but observant.
hesitation.
"I'll be
called
there
someone,"
tomorrow morning,"
she said.
The
Robert
call
nodded
ended
once.
without excess.
His daughter.
Without unnecessary
Margaret's
emotion.
gaze softened slightly.
But the connection
Then
itself
this
was
really
enough.
is more
the
than
past
chance.
had been reopened. Robert did not
And now
answer.
it was moving forward.
Because he no longer needed
Margaret
to.
watched him from across
the evidence
the room.
had already
Her
spoken.
expression calm
The night
but
passed
observant.
without rest. Not
"You called
fully.
someone," she said.
Robert remained near the fire,
nodded once,
checking the dogs
His
at
daughter.
intervals. Margaret's
Duke
gaze
had
regained
softened
enough
slightly.
strength to lift his
Then
head fully.
this really is
his gaze
more
following
than
Robert's
chance.
movements with renewed
Robert
clarity.
did not answer.
Luna
because he
remained
no longer
cautious,
needed to.
but stable. The
Her
evidence had
injured
already
legs still
spoken,
weak, but
the
bearing
night
weight
passed
and
without
short
rest.
shifts.
Not
Scout
fully.
was the concern.
Robert remained
Though
near
his
the fire,
breathing had improved,
checking the dogs at
it
intervals.
remained shallow.
Duke
His
had
recovery
regained enough
uncertain.
strength to lift his head
Robert
fully.
adjusted the
His
blankets
gaze
again.
following Robert's movements
His hands
with renewed
steady
clarity.
despite fatigue.
Luna remained
The habits
cautious,
of vigilance
but returning
stable.
as naturally
Her
as
injured
breath.
legs still weak,
Morning
but
came
bearing
with a
weight
pale
and short
light,
shifts,
and the distant
Scout
sound
was
of
the
an
concern.
engine cutting through the
Though
stillness.
his breathing had improved,
Robert stepped outside
remained
before the
shallow.
vehicle reached
His
the
recovery
clearing.
uncertain.
The truck that emerged
Robert
was
adjusted
not
the blankets
concealed,
again,
not cautious,
his hands steady
but direct,
despite fatigue.
And when it stopped,
The habits
Emily
of
stepped
vigilance
out,
returning
her
as
posture
naturally
straight,
as breath.
movements efficient.
Morning
dressed
came with a
in
pale
a dark
light,
jacket and utility
and the distant
pants.
sound of an engine
her hair
cutting through
tied
the
back
stillness.
tightly. Robert
She carried
stepped
herself
outside
with the
before
quiet
the vehicle
authority of
reached the
someone who
clearing.
had learned to be taken
the truck that
seriously in
emerged was
spaces
not
that did not
concealed,
offer it
not
freely.
cautious, but
Her
direct,
eyes met Robert's
and when it stopped,
immediately.
Emily
No
stepped
hesitation,
out, her posture
no
straight,
uncertainty,
movements
just
efficient,
assessment.
dressed in a dark
"Show me,"
jacket and
she
utility
said.
pants, and Robert
Her
led
hair
her inside
tied
without
back
a word.
tightly.
She
Emily
carried herself
knelt
with the
beside the
quiet
dogs,
authority of someone
her
who
gaze
had
moving
learned to
quickly,
be taken seriously
noting
in
condition,
spaces that did
restraint
not offer
marks,
it freely.
behavioral cues.
Her eyes met
"These aren't
Robert's
strays,"
immediately.
she said,
No
her voice
hesitation,
firm.
no uncertainty.
"They've been trained,
just
probably for
assessment,
security or
show me,
canine
she said.
operations."
And Robert
She
led her
examined
inside
the
without a
collar
word.
Robert had opened.
Emily
The
knelt
strip
beside
now
the
resting
dogs,
beside it,
her gaze moving
expression
quickly,
tightening slightly
noting
as she read
condition,
the words.
restraint marks,
"That's
behavioral
his,"
cues,
she said quietly.
"These aren't
Not
strays,"
as a question,
she said,
her
Robert
voice
nodded.
firm.
"They've
"We
been
found
trained,
tracks," he
probably
added,
for security
covered,
or canine
but not well
operations." She examined the
Emily
collar
stood,
Robert had
her
opened,
posture
shifting slightly
strip
as she
now
processed the
resting beside
information.
it.
Her expression
"There's been
tightening
talk,"
slightly as she
she
read the
said.
words. A private
"That's
K9
his," she said
contractor
quietly.
operating off-grid,
Not as a question.
training
Robert
dogs for
nodded.
security firms,
"We found
but cutting
tracks,"
costs
he
by
added.
eliminating those
"Covered,
that don't
but
meet
not well
standards.
enough."
Her jaw
Emily
stood,
tightened,
her posture
not
shifting
with
slightly as she
anger,
processed
but
the
with
information.
certainty.
"There's
"I've been trying
been
to build a
talk,"
case," she said,
but no direct evidence.
"A private
K9
She looked at Robert
contractor
again.
operating
"This
off-grid.
might be it."
Training
Before
dogs
Robert could
for
respond,
security
the low
firms,
rumble of
but
another
cutting
engine
costs
broke
by
through the
eliminating
air.
those that don't
Different
meet
this time.
standards. Heavier, her jaw
Less control.
tightened.
heightened.
Not
Emily's
with
head
anger,
turned toward the
but with
sound
certainty.
instantly. I've been
That's
trying to
not
build
mine,
a case,
she said.
but no direct evidence.
Robert had already
She
moved.
looked at Robert again,
stepping toward the door.
This might be
His
it.
body aligning
Before Robert
with
could
instinct.
respond, the low rumble of another engine broke
now.
through the
Something
air.
held in check.
Different this time.
The truck
Heavier,
that emerged from the tree
less
line was
controlled.
darker.
Emily's
unmarked.
head turned toward the
Its
sound
approach not
instantly.
concealed, but not
That's
cautious
not
either,
mine,
as if
she
whoever
said.
drove it did not
Robert
expect
had
resistance.
already moved.
The
Stepping
vehicle
toward the
stopped
door,
near the edge of the
his
clearing,
body aligning
and
with
two men
instinct.
stepped out.
But
The
something
first,
was different
tall
now.
and broad,
Something held
with a
in
thick
check.
beard and a heavy coat.
The
that
truck
did
that
little to
emerged
hide
from the
his
tree
rigid
line was
posture.
darker.
Unmarked.
His movements controlled,
Its
but
approach
lacking the
concealed,
refinement
but
of
not
formal
cautious
training.
either, as if
The
whoever
second,
drove it did not expect
younger,
resistance.
leaner,
The vehicle
with sharp
stopped
features
near the
and
edge of the
restless
clearing.
eyes.
His
The two men
stance less
stepped out.
stable, more
The
reactive.
first, tall
They
and
looked
broad,
toward the cabin,
with a thick beard
then
and a
at
heavy
Robert,
coat that did little to
measuring
hide
him
his
quickly,
rigid posture,
dismissing him just as
his
fast.
movements controlled, but
Those
lacking
dogs
the
aren't
refinement
yours,
of formal
the
training.
older man said.
The
His
second,
voice rough,
younger,
carrying authority
leaner,
built on habit,
with sharp
rather
features
than
and
right.
restless eyes.
Robert
His stance
did
less
not
stable,
respond immediately.
more reactive.
His gaze
They
steady,
looked toward the cabin,
unshaken. Then at Robert.
Behind him, Margaret
Measuring
stood near
him
the
quickly,
doorway,
dismissing
her
him
hands
just as
clasped
fast.
lightly. Her lips
Those
moving
dogs
in a
aren't
silent
yours,
prayer.
the older man
But her
said.
posture did not
His voice
retreat.
rough. She had
Carrying
already called the
authority
sheriff
built on
earlier
habit
that morning,
rather than right.
Her faith paired
Robert
with action
did not respond immediately.
Emily stepped forward,
his
slightly,
gaze steady,
her presence
unshaken.
shifting the dynamic.
Behind him, Margaret
"You're
stood near the
trespassing,"
doorway.
she said,
her hands
her
clasped
voice
lightly,
calm but firm,
her lips moving in a silent
The younger
prayer.
man smirked
But
faintly,
her posture did
but
not
the older
retreat.
one's eyes narrowed.
She had already called the
Recalculating.
sheriff earlier that
Robert
morning.
could feel the tension
Her
building.
faith paired with
The
action.
familiar edge where
Emily
action
stepped
could
forward
turn violent.
slightly.
Her
His
presence
body
shifting
prepared,
the dynamic,
aware of angles,
"You're
distances,
trespassing,"
outcomes.
she said.
He could
Her
end
voice
this quickly,
calm but firm.
efficiently, but he did not
The younger
move.
man smirked
Not yet.
faintly, but
Not
the
like
older one's
that.
eyes narrowed.
Instead, he
Recalculating.
stepped forward just enough
Robert
to close
could
the
feel
distance
tension
without threatening
building.
it.
The familiar
His
edge
voice
where
low,
action
but
could
carrying
turn
weight.
violent.
You need to leave.
His body
he
prepared,
said,
aware of
not
angles,
a command,
distances,
not a plea,
outcomes,
just a statement.
He could end this quickly.
The older man
efficiently,
scoffed,
but he
shifting
did not
his
move.
stance. Not
But
yet.
before anything could
Not
escalate
like that.
further,
But before anything could
Instead,
escalate
he stepped
further,
forward
the distant
just
sound
enough
of
to close the
sirens
distance
cut
without
through the
threatening
tension.
it. Sharp, his voice
Unmistakable,
low, but carrying weight. The younger
You need
man's
to leave,
confidence faltered
he
instantly.
Not
The
a
older
command,
one glanced toward
not
the
a
road,
plea,
just
calculation
a statement
replacing certainty.
The older man scoffed.
Within minutes,
shifting his
two
stance.
sheriff vehicles
But
broke
before
through
anything
the
could
trees.
escalate further,
Lights
the distant
flashing
sound of
against the
sirens
snow.
cut through the tension.
Officers stepping
Sharp,
out with controlled
unmistakable.
urgency. Weapons visible,
The younger
but not
man's
raised.
confidence faltered instantly.
Emily moved forward.
The older
to meet
one
them.
glanced toward the road,
Her voice clear,
calculation
as she outlined
replacing
the
certainty.
situation.
Within
Evidence
minutes,
presented
two
quickly,
sheriff vehicles broke
efficiently.
through the trees.
The men were detained
Lights
without
flashing
resistance.
against the snow.
Their authority
Officers
dissolving the
stepping
moment
out
it was
with controlled
challenged by
urgency.
something legitimate.
Weapons visible,
As
but
the
not
scene
raised.
stabilized, Emily
Robert
moved
stood
forward
still,
to meet them, watching.
her voice clear,
not with
as she
satisfaction,
outlined the
but with a
situation.
quiet understanding.
Evidence presented
This
quickly,
could have ended
efficiently.
differently.
It
The
would
men
have
were
once,
detained
but
without
it hadn't.
resistance. Not
Their
this
authority
time.
dissolving the
He had
moment it
chosen
was
not to
challenged by
escalate,
something legitimate.
not to fall back into
As
the
the
version
scene
of himself that
stabilized,
solved everything
Robert
through
stood
force.
still, and as the officers began
not
to
with
search the truck,
satisfaction,
but with a quiet
uncovering
understanding,
cages, equipment,
this could have ended
and the
differently.
unmistakable signs
It would
of more
have once,
animals
but
kept
it
under
hadn't.
the same conditions.
Not this time.
The truth
He had chosen
became
not to escalate,
undeniable,
not to fall back into
This
the
was
version
not
of
an
himself that
isolated
solved
act.
everything through
It
force.
was a system,
And
it
as
was
the
ending
officers began
here.
to search the truck,
Margaret stepped
uncovering
closer,
cages,
her
equipment,
voice a sus
and the
sucked
unmistakable
but certain.
signs of more animals
You didn't
kept under the
fight,
same
she
conditions.
said.
The
Robert
truth
looked at her
became
briefly, then back at the
undeniable.
scene unfolding before him.
This was not an isolated
I didn't
act.
have to.
It
he
was
replied.
a system, and it was
And in
ending
that simple
here.
statement,
The
Margaret
man he
stepped
had
closer,
been, and the
her
man he
voice
had
sus
become
and
stood
certain,
side by
but certain.
side. No longer in
didn't fight,
conflict, but
she
finally
said.
in balance. The days that
Robert
followed
looked
did
at her
not
briefly,
arrive
then
with
back at the scene
celebration or
unfolding
noise.
before him.
They came quietly.
I didn't have to.
As most
he
meaningful
replied.
changes did in
And
places
in that
like
simple
this,
statement,
carried on
the
the
man
same
he had
cold
been,
air that
and
the
the
man
man
he
held
had
silence,
become
but
stood
now
side
seemed to
by
carry
side.
something else,
No longer in
something
conflict,
alive.
but finally
Robert
in balance.
Hayes stood
The
outside
days
his
that followed
cabin
did
in
not
the early
arrive
light.
with celebration
The snow
or
beneath
noise.
his boots no
They came
longer
quietly,
untouched, but marked
as
with
most
movement,
meaningful changes did in
purpose.
places
The
like
clearing
this.
had changed,
carried on the
not
same
in structure,
cold air
but
that
in
once held
presence,
silence,
but
but
now
now
seemed
seemed
to
to
carry
carry
something
stillness,
else. There were now
something
paths,
alive,
Small
Robert
tracks
Hayes
pressed into
stood
the snow
outside
by
his
paws
cabin
that
in
no
the
longer
early
trembled
light.
with weakness.
The snow beneath his boots
Duke
no longer
moved first,
untouched, but marked
his
with
body
movement.
no longer rigid
with
purpose,
cold, but strong
the clearing
again.
had changed.
His coat
Not in
restored
structure,
to its
but
natural
in
black and
presence.
tan, where once
Though
there
faint
had been
scars
stillness,
remained where
the
there were
rope
now
had cut
paths.
into him. Small tracks
Marks
pressed
that
into
did not
the snow
weaken
by
him, but
paws that no
defined
longer
him.
trembled with weakness.
He walked with a steady,
Duke
controlled
moved
gait.
first, always
His body
slightly
no longer
ahead,
rigid with cold,
always
but
aware,
strong again.
His
His
head
coat
turning just
restored
enough to
to its
monitor
natural
both the
black and
environment
tan,
and the people within
though
it.
faint scars remained
The
where the
role
rope
of
had
leader
cut into
had
him.
not been given to
Marks
him.
that did not
It
weaken
had
him,
simply
but
returned.
defined him. He
Luna
walked with a
followed at a
steady,
measured
controlled
distance,
gait,
her injured
always
leg
slightly
healed,
ahead,
but still favoring
always
caution.
aware.
Her frame
His head
lean
turning
and
just
precise,
enough to monitor
every
both the
movement
environment and the
intentional.
people within it.
She had not lost her instinct.
The role of
to
leader
assess,
had not
to
been
question.
given to him.
But now her
It had
gaze
simply
no
returned.
longer carried suspicion toward Robert
Luna
or
followed
Margaret
at a measured distance.
Instead, it settled
Her
into
injured
something
leg
closer to
healed,
loyalty,
but still
favoring
not
caution.
blind, but
Her
chosen.
frame lean and precise.
Then there was Scout.
Every movement
Smaller
intentional.
still, his body
She had
not
not
as
lost her
powerful as the
instinct
others,
to
but
assess,
no longer fragile.
to question.
His coat lighter.
But now her gaze
soft
no
golden
longer
tones
carried
beneath the
suspicion
black
toward
saddle
Robert
pattern.
or Margaret.
His eyes brighter
Instead,
now,
it settled
carrying
into something
that
closer
had
to
not been there
loyalty.
before.
Not blind,
Not just survival,
chosen,
but
curiosity.
And then there was Scout. He moved
Smaller
closer
still,
to Robert
his
than
body
the others.
not as powerful
Not
as the
out of
others, but no
dependence,
longer
but
fragile.
connection.
His coat,
A quiet
lighter,
bond
with
that
soft
had golden
golden
tones
tones
beneath the
first
black saddle
moments
pattern.
between life
His
and
eyes
loss.
brighter now,
Inside
carrying
the cabin
something
the
that had not
changes
been
were
there
even more
before.
evident. Not just
What had once been a
survival,
place
but
defined by function had
curiosity
begun to shift towards
He
something
moved
that
closer
held
to
purpose.
Robert than the others.
Blankets
Not
no
out of
longer folded
dependence,
untouched, but
connection.
spread where the
A
dogs
quiet
rested.
bond that had
Bowls
formed in
placed
those
carefully
first
near the hearth.
moments between life
Tools
and loss.
still arranged with precision.
Inside the cabin, the
But
changes
now,
were
sharing
even more
space
evident.
with items that spoke of
What
care
had once
rather
been a
than
place defined by
isolation.
function had begun
Margaret
to shift
Collins
towards something
moved through
that
the
held
space with
purpose.
ease that had not existed
Blankets
before.
no longer folded untouched,
Her
but
presence
spread
no
where
longer
the dogs
tentative.
rested. She had become
Bowls
part of
placed
the
carefully
rhythm,
near the hearth.
not as a visitor.
Tools
but
still
as someone who
arranged with
belonged.
precision.
Her gray
now
hair
sharing
tied back
space with
loosely as
items
she
that
worked.
spoke of care
Her
rather
hands
than
steady as she
isolation.
prepared food, not
Margaret
just for
Collins
herself,
moved through the
but
space
for
with
all of
ease
them.
that had not existed
Her
before.
movements carried a quiet
Her
confidence
presence no
shaped
longer
by
tentative.
years of tending to others.
She had become
shaped by
part of the
years
rhythm,
tending to others,
not as a visitor,
of building
but
small
as someone who
warmths in
belonged.
cold places. Her gray hair
They're
tied back
stronger
loosely
today,
as she worked,
she said,
her
as
hands
Robert
steady
stepped
as she
inside.
prepared food, not
Her
just
voice
for
calm,
herself,
but
carrying a note
but
of
for all of
satisfaction. Her
Robert
movements carried a
nodded,
quiet
watching
confidence
as Duke
shaped by
settled near
years
the
of
door,
tending to others, positioning himself
of
where he
building
could see
small
both
warmths in
inside and
cold
out,
places.
always aware.
They're stronger
They'll
today,
hold,
she said,
he replied,
as Robert stepped inside.
The words simple,
her voice
but calm,
certain,
but carrying a
the
note
sound of another
satisfaction.
vehicle
approached slowly
Robert
from
nodded,
the road, watching
not
as Duke
urgent,
settled near the
not
door,
intrusive.
positioning himself
And when
where
it
he could
stopped,
see both
Robert did not
inside and
tense,
out. Always
did not
aware.
prepare for confrontation
They'll
because
hold, he already
he
knew who
replied.
it would be. The words
Emily
simple,
Reed
but
stepped
certain.
out.
The
Her
sound of
posture
another
as direct
vehicle
as ever.
approached slowly from
Though
the road.
there was something different
not
now,
urgent,
not
something
intrusive.
less guarded in the way she approached.
And when it stopped, Robert
her
did not
investigation had
tense,
moved quickly
did not
after the
prepare for
arrest.
confrontation
the
because
evidence
he
from the
already
truck,
knew who it would be.
combined with records she
Emily
had been building
Reed
for months,
stepped out.
had
Her
exposed
posture
more
as
than
direct
just a
as
single
ever.
operation.
Though there was
It had
something
uncovered
different
a
now.
network. Something
And though the
less
legal
guarded in
process
the way
would
she
take
approached,
time,
the outcome
her
was no
investigation
longer
had
uncertain.
moved quickly after the
She
arrest.
stepped onto the porch.
The evidence
her
from the
gaze
truck,
briefly taking
combined
in the
with
dogs
records
before
she had been
settling
building
on
for
Robert,
months,
had exposed
"They're
more
talking,"
than just a single
she said,
operation, referring to
It
the
had
men who
uncovered
had been
a
taken
network.
into custody.
And though the legal
her
process
voice
would
steady,
take time, the
enough
outcome
to
was
bring
no
the
longer
rest of it
uncertain.
down. She stepped
Robert
onto the
inclined
porch,
his
her
head
gaze
slightly,
briefly taking
not
in
in
the dogs
approval,
before
but
settling
in
on
acknowledgement.
Robert. Emily's
"They're
eyes
talking,"
shifted towards
she
Scout,
said,
who had
referring to
approached
the
her
men who had been
cautiously,
taken into
but without
custody.
fear. Her voice steady.
"He's the one, isn't he?"
Enough
she
to bring
said
the rest of
quietly.
it down.
Robert followed her gaze.
Robert inclined his
He
head
held on.
slightly, not in approval,
Emily crouched
but in
slightly,
acknowledgement.
extending her hand slowly,
Emily's eyes shifted
allowing
towards
Scout to close the distance
who had
himself.
approached her cautiously.
When he
but
did,
without fear,
she
smiled faintly.
"He's the one,
The
isn't
expression
he?"
brief,
she
but
said
genuine.
quietly.
He reminds me
Robert
of him,
followed her gaze.
she said.
He
Not
held on,
needing to specify who.
Emily
Robert
Margaret did not respond verbally, but the look in his eyes held agreement, allowing Scout to close the distance himself, offering Emily a small container. She smiled faintly. "You should eat before you go." Brief, she said, genuine. Her tone reminds me of him, but firm in the way of someone who had learned that care did not need permission. Robert did not respond verbally, but the look in his eyes held agreement. She replied. Margaret stepped forward, and for a moment, offering the three of them stood in a quiet understanding that extended beyond the situation itself. Her tone warm but firm in the way of someone who had learned that care did not need permission. It was about what had been carried forward. Accepted it with a nod. What had been chosen. Thank you, she replied. Later that afternoon, and for a moment, a small group of people stood in a quiet understanding that extended beyond the situation members itself, of the nearby community, beyond the drawn case, by Margaret's quiet efforts to share what had happened. It was about what among had been them carried was Daniel forward. Carter, what had been a retired chosen. Veterinarian in his early 70s. That afternoon, his small group of people slightly bent, not his hands still steady, not strangers, his white beard but members steady. Of the nearby community, his white beard drawn by Margaret's neatly. Quiet efforts to share what had happened, but observant. Among them was Daniel by decades Carter, of working with animals, a retired veterinarian in his early 70s. He approached the dogs with calm slightly bent, but his hands still steady. Luna's leg, his white beard's responsive neatly. And finally kneeling beside but observant, his touch gentle, shaped by decades of working with animals that could not speak for themselves, he said after a moment. He approached the dogs his voice with carrying the certainty of experience, examining Luna's leg, especially this checking one, Duke's responsiveness, glancing and finally Robert. Kneeling beside Scout. He's got something in him gentle, that doesn't let go. Robert gave a small nod, he said after understanding the truth in his voice more carrying the certainty of experience alone suggested, especially the others who came did not stay glancing at Robert, but they brought he's got something in him that doesn't let go. Food. Robert gave a small nod that spoke not of understanding the truth and shared more deeply than the words alone. And as the sun began to lower, the others casting long shadows across the snow. But they brought Robert stood once more outside blankets, the cabin. Food, a wooden board, small offhands that spoke not of obligation, rough, but of shared humanity. The letters carved into it, as the sun began to lower it, casting long shadows across the snow. He positioned it Robert near the entrance, stood once more securing outside it with the cabin movements. A wooden board, not ceremonial, but meaningful. The surface rough, but solid. When he stepped back, the letters moved carved into it simple, but her eyes resting on the sign, no one left behind. He positioned it near the entrance, securing it with steady movements. Robert looked at the words, not ceremonial, then out across the clearing. Now marked with life back, instead of Margaret emptiness. Moved beside him. I couldn't her eyes resting Thomas, on the sign, he said. Then on him, his voice low. It not fits. Burdened this time, but she said softly. Honest. Robert but looked I didn't at the walk words, away this time. Then out across Margaret's the expression softened. Now marked with life steady. Instead of emptiness. You didn't lose him. I couldn't save Thomas, gently, he said. You just found his where he led you. Not burdened this time, the words but settled honest. Into the space between them. But I didn't walk away not this comfort. Time. Margaret's expression softened, and as Duke took position near the porch, you didn't lose him. Luna, resting just gently. Behind him, you just found moving closer to Robert's side. The words the cold no longer felt like something to endure, not as something that existed around a warmth that had finally found its place. And as Duke took position near the porch, in that quiet, grounded moment, resting just behind Hayes him, understood that this was not closer to Robert's side. It was no longer felt like something to endure, to stand all but along. Something that existed around a warmth that had finally found do not arrive as light in the sky, and in that quiet, grounded moment, Robert Hayes understood that this was not the in the form of lives placed directly in our path the beginning when we least expected he had been meant to stand asking all us along. Not for perfection, sometimes for a choice. Miracles do not arrive a moment as light where we decide whether to walk away above. Or to step forward with what strength we still have, in the form of lives placed that is directly in our path when we least expect them, not by removing our pain asking us or rewriting our past, but by giving it purpose, a moment where we decide whether to walk away by placing something fragile in our hands so that in saving it, we begin to heal something that is how God works, just like Robert did when he chose not to turn our past. And maybe in your life right now there is placing something fragile in our hands so that in saving like it, an interruption, we begin to heal something you are too tired to face, just like Robert did. But what if that is not a coincidence? Turn away? And maybe in your life right now there is something or someone your chance to become the answer to someone else's like prayer. An interruption. If this story you are too tired to face, take a moment to write. What if that is not a coincidence? Share this story with someone who might need hope today. Your chance to become the answer to some more stories of faith, courage, if this story touched your heart, and may God watch over you, write amen in the comments. Protect your heart, share this story, and bring light into your life exactly when you need it most. Subscribe to the channel by giving more stories of faith, by placing something fragile in our hands, so that in saving God watch over you, we begin to heal something within ourselves. Protect your heart, just like light into your life exactly when you chose not to turn away most.